Robert Mugabe, the former president of Zimbabwe, has died at the age of 95. Mugabe was at the centre of his country's struggle for independence and became its first prime minister in 1980, before becoming president 7 years later. His reputation as a hero of the independence movement was overshadowed, though, by the corruption and human rights abuses which marred his time in power, and his policies caused the collapse of Zimbabwe's economy. He was forced from office by his own party in 2017. Shingai Nyoka looks back at his life.
He was once Zimbabwe's liberator, leading a war against white minority rule. But by the end, the adulation President Robert Mugabe once enjoyed was gone. He cemented his power, winning overwhelmingly at elections in 1980. As leader of a new nation, he set about creating a better country than the one he inherited. And for a while, he succeeded.
There can never be any return to the state of armed conflict which existed before our commitment to peace and the democratic process of election under the Lancaster House Agreement. Surely, this is now time to beat our swords into plowshares.
But beneath the veneer lay a dark side. Mr. Mugabe deployed a crack military unit to southern Zimbabwe to deal with hundreds of insurgents. Between 1983 and 1987, thousands were murdered, and the world turned a blind eye. Mugabe was the great hope. But as the 1990s ended, the economy was bottoming out, and a new political party was on the rise. Seemingly desperate to regain popularity, Mr. Mugabe played a political hand. Land seized by the colonial government was still in the hands of the white minority. Sensing the frustration, Mugabe encouraged blacks to take back their land, and they did, often violently. The Western world took note, breaking diplomatic ties and imposing economic sanctions. The opposition, its leaders, human rights workers bore the brunt of his anger. In 2008, in the midst of billion% inflation and widespread unemployment, Mr. Mugabe suffered his first electoral defeat. It only led to more violence in the second round of voting. Britain stripped him of his knighthood, and former allies condemned him.
Nearer to home, we had seen the outbreak of violence against fellow Africans in our own country, and the tragic failure of leadership in our neighboring Zimbabwe.
But he remained a cult-like figure among many Africans for daring to challenge Western political dominance on the world's affairs.
In retaliation for the measures we took to empower the black majority, the United Kingdom has mobilized her friends and allies in Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand to impose illegal economic sanctions against Zimbabwe.
But within his own party, discontent was rising. Many believed he had overstayed and needed to hand over power. His second wife, Grace Mugabe, 40 years his junior, seemed to be gaining power, and she began accusing then Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa of trying to oust them. Mr. Mugabe finally fired his longtime aide, accusing him of trying to topple him. Mr. Mnangagwa, with the help of the military, mounted a comeback, posting soldiers on the streets and placing Mr. Mugabe under house arrest. Tens of thousands of Zimbabweans marched, calling on him to step down. And after the threat of impeachment, he resigned. In his last years, Mr. Mugabe had retreated to the seclusion of his mansion. Many will remember him as a gifted orator and visionary who liberated Zimbabwe, but later returned her to the shackles of oppression.
In the last few minutes, we've had a statement from the Gleneagles Hospital in Singapore saying, "We are saddened by the news of the passing of Mr. Robert Mugabe, former president of Zimbabwe." Our correspondent Karishma Vaswani is at the hospital and has sent us this update.
I'm standing in front of the prestigious and exclusive Gleneagles Hospital here in Singapore, which is where it's thought that Robert Mugabe spent a fair amount of time, in fact the last few months of his life. He was frequently spotted here receiving medical treatment for a condition that we don't know at this point, but he also had links to Singapore. One of his children, his daughter, graduated from a private university here, and he was spotted at that graduation photograph there. His wife, Grace Mugabe, often accompanied him on these trips, and she was also seen in some of Singapore's most expensive shopping districts carrying lots of shopping bags. Now, it's not clear what condition he died of, but the Singapore Health Science Authority has told the BBC that there was no coroner or police at his death, which appears to suggest that he may well have died of natural causes. At this point in time, the Singapore government is keeping rather tight-lipped about his death, but that's understandable given that he was such a high-profile figure in international politics.
Karishma Vaswani in Singapore. Well, you saw Shingai Nyoko's report a moment ago. She's in Harare and has been gauging reaction there to the news of Robert Mugabe's death.
Well, I'm in the central business district where all the commerce takes place, but you wouldn't think that such an important figure in Zimbabwe's history has died. Many people are going about their ordinary chores, their day-to-day chores, selling their wares on the streets and walking around. And I think it speaks to the fact that by the time that he had died, which is in the early hours of this morning, Robert Mugabe had already become a historic figure. He's been out of power for 2 years, but there has been some discussion about the kind of legacy that he leaves behind, and many people would agree that it's a checkered history. Some are conflicted. He was Zimbabwe's liberator. Emerson Mnangagwa called him a founding father of Zimbabwe, but the repression is difficult to run away from, and the fact that he had to be ousted from office after taking Zimbabwe from a prosperous nation to one that was full of hunger with an unemployment rate of 80%.
Well, let's cross now to Johannesburg. Our correspondent Milton Nkosi is there. Milton, hello to you. A hugely controversial figure, a dominant figure in African political life for so many decades. How do you think people are going to be reacting to the news of Robert Mugabe's death?
Well, this morning, people both here in South Africa and indeed in Zimbabwe and across the rest of the African continent are giving a mixed reaction to Robert Mugabe's passing. There are many who see him as a dictator, and there are others who still remember him as a liberator. Now, remember that Robert Mugabe was fighting white minority rule in what was then called Rhodesia. He was locked up in prison for 10 years, was never even allowed to bury his son. And when that ended, he became the first democratically elected leader of Zimbabwe and succeeded in healthcare and education. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, things went horribly wrong when he began his land redistribution program, invading farms across Zimbabwe.
Do you think that what might be seen as the positive aspects of his legacy will be ultimately overshadowed by the corruption scandals, by the violence that marred his rule for so long, or will there be some revisionism going on?
Oh, yes, indeed, that is spot on. There is such a mixed reaction that his liberation credentials, if you like, are not entirely overshadowed by the corruption that followed later in his political life. People are remembering that Robert Mugabe was one of the most educated leaders in the world with over 6 degrees. And also, they remember a speech he gave here in South Africa back in September 2002 when he told British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and he said, "Tony Blair, keep your England and let me keep my Zimbabwe." And those words are now being tweeted and posted on social media sites this morning in remembrance of Robert Mugabe's Pan-Africanist political ideology.
OK, Milton, thank you for that. Milton and Cozy in Johannesburg. Let's talk now to John Simpson, our World Affairs editor. John, of course, a frequent visitor to Zimbabwe. What are your reflections, your memories of your encounters with Robert Mugabe?
Well, I think I interviewed him 7 times altogether at the height of his powers. And the interesting thing was that he was always, whoever he might have been there with, sometimes I remember I once interviewed him with a lot of British Foreign Office officials in the room. And you knew that Robert Mugabe was the brightest person in the room, and he could turn an interview round and humiliate you on camera. He loved doing that. Very, very sharp, but still always a very bitter kind of man. I mean, listening to what the other contributors have been saying, of course, all of this is true, but I think the great problem that Zimbabwe had was that Britain in particular and other countries decided after 1980 that the problem had been sorted out, and they didn't want to know what was going on in Zimbabwe. And what was going on from 1982, for instance, onwards was that Robert Mugabe got in the North Korean army, and the most brutal part of a most brutal army, to help him go through the towns and villages of Matabeleland, which was the area where the main opposition to him lay. 20,000 people were murdered, many of them actually burned to death during that campaign. It was a savage business and marked Zimbabwe ever afterwards.
It marked Zimbabwe ever afterwards. It will obviously mark Robert Mugabe's legacy. Do you think he will be mostly remembered for that rather than the early part of his political career?
Well, I think it'll depend who's doing the remembering, to be honest. Any kind of nationalist figure is likely to recall his tremendous achievements as the leader of the liberation struggle. But I think most ordinary people, certainly the people that I've spent quite a lot of time talking to over the years, will remember the man who sold out the country effectively, who looted it, who ensured that those early achievements of his in education and in medicine, and Zimbabweans are still probably the best educated people on the continent of Africa, but nevertheless all that went as Mugabe simply looted the treasury and took the money out of the country.
OK, John, thank you very much. John Simpson there, our World Affairs editor.